Start cheyala. Good morning to all. I hope you all been well and healthy and staying nicely at home. Today's topic is malaria. Malaria is an important topic. There's a lot to cover. There's also a lot of reading that you have to do on your own. I'll try to cover as much as I can. Let's start. So malaria, that's the mosquito, female Anopheles mosquito. Malaria is the most important parasitic disease known to man, uh, caused by the genus Plasmodium and transmitted by the female Anopheles mosquito. It has spread about around 108 countries, affecting almost 3 billion population, and has been recorded to cause 2,000 deaths per day. Malaria is caused by 6 known species. Plasmodium falciparum is the most deadly. It's prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa. Plasmodium vivax is prevalent in Asia, and then there's Plasmodium malariae. There are 2 subspecies of Plasmodium ovale, P. wallicheri and P. curtisi. Then at last there's something called Plasmodium knowlesi that is transmitted to monkeys. It's called as monkey malaria. So this is found in southeastern Asia. A little bit of history. Malaria was initially known as the ague. It was first described as regular paroxysms of intermittent fever by Hippocrates, and it was initially thought to be a bacterial disease. Later, Charles Laveran surmised that it is actually a parasitic disease which occupies the RBC. A little later, Ronald Ross reported that transmission occurs through Anopheline mosquitoes. A few years after that, Julius Wagner experimented for the treatment of neurosyphilis using the serum of patients who had recovered from malaria. So this he called as malaria therapy. For some reason, it worked for a while, but it stopped after the advent of penicillins. Okay, so this is the little bit of history, and all 3 of these scientists won Nobel Prizes for their work. Next, coming to the geography, malaria is prevalent in Central America, South America, most of Africa, little bit of the Middle East, India, and Southeastern Asia. Okay? Uh, Around the 19th century, the disease was eradicated from North America and Europe and Russia. Uh, However, from 1970s to 2000s, there's been a surge in the number of infections again. It's thought to be because of the resistance, both of the malaria parasite to anti-malarial drugs, as well as resistance of the vector to insect repellents. Okay, so history is done, geography is over. Let's go to the life cycle now. The story starts when the female Anopheles mosquito lands on the human skin, takes a blood meal and releases sporozoites into the bloodstream of the human. Okay, either via lymphatics or directly through the blood vessels, the sporozoites are transferred to the liver. Okay, this takes anything between 45 minutes to 2 hours. Okay, so in the liver, the sporozoites collect, they develop into something called merozoites. This cycle, which takes place in the liver, lasts anything between 5.5 to 15 days. Okay, so the merozoites are quite motile and they are round in shape, and anywhere between 5 to 15 days they are released from the liver into the bloodstream. Okay, once in the bloodstream, these merozoites which are motile invade the RBC. Okay, once they invade the RBC, they develop into ring forms. Different species have quite typical ring forms. You must have read it in microbiology. Please go back to your textbooks and revise once more. I'm not covering all that. From that, it develops into early trophozoite. From the trophozoite, begins to grow in size. Okay, at this point, it's pretty much using up all of the energy and all of the materials which are stored inside the red blood cells. Okay, at one point, it develops into the schizont form. The schizont form undergoes nuclear division. Uh, when the RBC is containing anything between 6 to 30 schizons, it ruptures. Okay, Once it ruptures, then again merozoites are released back into the bloodstream. Okay? Merozoites can be released either from the liver into the bloodstream or from the ruptured RBC into the bloodstream. So this cycle, this asexual reproduction that takes place in the liver is called pre-erythrocytic cycle. The one that takes place in the RBC is called erythrocytic cycle. These merozoites go on to infect other RBC. After a few cycles are over, then they transform into gametocytes of P. falciparum, both male and female. So this cycle continues when another mosquito lands on the human to take another blood meal. Okay, at that point, the gametocytes are ingested by the mosquito. Gametocytes mature into gametes. Gametes fuse to form the zygote. The mosquito is minding its own business. It doesn't know that there's a dating pool happening. So the zygote transforms into a long whip-like organism called as ookinete. This ookinete penetrates into the epithelium of the midgut of the mosquito and transforms into a round substance called as oocyst. Okay, within this oocyst, again there is nuclear division. After which there is development of sporozoites. These sporozoites are then transferred to the salivary gland of the mosquito via the lymphatics, and then the cycle continues when the mosquito again bites the next human host. Okay, so one thing to remember, since the asexual reproduction is taking place inside the human is the secondary host. So since the sexual reproduction, the fusing of the gametes takes place inside the mosquito is the primary host of the plasmodium. So one thing to remember in this, for Plasmodium vivax and Plasmodium ovale, few of the sporozoites that invade the liver stay put within the liver for a duration of 3 weeks to 1 year. Okay, these dormant states of the parasite are called as hypnozoites. Okay, so this is why with these two species there are many recorded cases of relapses. I think that's all there is to cover in this slide. Just for comparison, Plasmodium falciparum has an intrahepatic phase of 5 days. Vivax and ovale has a intrahepatic phase of 8 to 9 days. Malaria has the longest, okay, for 15 days. The erythrocytic cycle ranges from 48 to 72 hours. For falciparum, vivax and ovale, it's more or less 48 to 50 hours. And for malaria, it's a little longer at 72 hours. You can go through this table later. I'll email this to one of you. These are the two important points to remember. So one thing to remember, whenever the RBC lyses, the RBC ruptures to release the merozoites into the bloodstream, that's when the systemic symptoms of fever, chills, and rigors start to develop. Okay, so this duration of 48 hours for vivax, ovale, and falciparum is the reason why the fever spikes occur once in 2 days for these three species, whereas for P. malariae, the fever spikes occur once in 72 hours, that is 3 days. Okay, so going to the epidemiology, there is a complex interplay between the host factors, the vector factors, the parasite factors, as well as the geographical and environmental factors. So in this slide, I'll be talking about the vector factors. The vector is female Anopheles mosquito. More than 400 kinds have been discovered, out of which 100 have been identified to carry the malaria parasite, out of which 40 have been described to be clinically important. Okay? One thing that's important to consider is the longevity of the mosquito, because it takes time for the ingested gametocytes to mature into the gamete form within the mosquito. Okay, it takes anything between 8 to 36 days. So it's pointless for transmission if the mosquito is killed immediately after the blood meal. Okay, so it has to survive for a minimum of 7 days after ingestion of the blood. So mosquito longevity is important. Another factor to consider is the temperature outside. Okay, so this is also with respect to the gamete forms. The gamete forms will not, the gametocytes side forms will not mature at temperatures between 16 degrees Celsius and more than 33 degrees Celsius. So this temperature range should be maintained in order for the parasite to transmit. Another thing is altitude. So transmission has not been described at altitudes greater than 2000. What the book says is that again the lower altitudes are necessary for the sexual maturity to take place, but I suspect it's because I don't think mosquitoes can fly that high. So yeah, with these factors into consideration, two types of transmission have been described. So stable transmission is described as frequent, constant, and year-round transmission of the malaria parasite. Unstable transmission has been described as focal, erratic, and low volume transmission, which is confined only to a small period of time, maybe a few months per year, maybe during monsoon season. Okay, so these are the vector factors that play a role. Coming to the host factors, so the age of the host is important. Severe falciparum malaria is seen more in the younger age group, in places where there is stable year-long transmission. So what happens there is the youngest age group are the most vulnerable to infection. They either die of the disease or they build up resistance, so that they don't really suffer from the symptoms once they're older. Although they have the infection, they don't suffer from the symptoms. So you know the saying, what they say, you either die a hero or you stick around long enough to become the villain. So either the patients die very young or they develop an immunity. So this phenomenon is called as premonition, wherein the infection is present in the body but the patient is asymptomatic. This is what happens in stable transmission. In places where there is unstable transmission, the young adults and pregnant females are more affected. Young adults, it doesn't take much imagination. These are the people who go out into the forests for hunting or cutting wood. So they're more prone to getting mosquito bites. Pregnant females generally are more immunocompromised as opposed to normal people. So I guess they must be more at risk. Apart from this, the host factors also genetic factors play a role. Certain hemoglobinopathies, while the patient suffers from the hemoglobinopathy, they protect against severe falciparum malaria, mainly because the malaria parasite, the plasmodium parasite, cannot survive inside the environment of these hemoglobinopathy cells. Okay, so in sickle cell anemia, the oxygen tension is quite low. There's not enough energy to go around. In G6PD deficiency, also something similar. In thalassemia and Malaysian ovulocytosis, the RBC membrane is quite thick. Okay, so it's difficult for the malaria parasite to penetrate. So while the patients suffer from the anemia because of the hemoglobinopathy itself, they're protected against malaria infection. So these are the host factors. Then I'll be talking about a few parasite factors like drug resistance, rate of multiplication, invasion pathways, cytoadherence. I'll be talking about it later, and malaria toxin. Then apart from that, there are also geographical factors like geographical and social factors like socioeconomic status, political stability, the access to treatment, intensity of transmission. So all of these play a role in the clinical outcome. Okay? So yeah. Then coming to the pathogenesis has three subheadings. So the first is RBC changes, then you have the host response. Okay, so RBC changes. What happens within 12 to 15 hours of the invasion of the parasite into the RBC, membrane protuberances called as knobs appear on the RBC surface. Okay, these extrude a protein called as PFEMP. PF is Plasmodium falciparum. EMP is erythrocyte membrane protein 1. Okay, so that's the protein from the parasite side, which binds to a receptor called as I forgot the name. I'll get back with the name later, but different tissues have different receptors. Okay, so the receptor in the brain is called ICAM, intercellular cellular adhesion membrane. I'm sorry, intercellular adhesion membrane. Then in the placenta, there's a receptor called as chondroitin sulfate B. In other organs, there's a receptor called CD36. Okay, so apart from the endothelial surface, the parasite also, the RBC can also attach to other uninfected RBC. So this phenomenon is called rosetting. And also via platelets, the infected RBC can attach to other infected RBC. Okay, so that is called as agglutination. So auto is used when it attaches to similar cells. Okay, so auto agglutination is when it adheres to other parasitized RBC. So this table shows your, this diagram shows your cytoadherence to the endothelial cells. This is autoadherence, platelet-mediated clumping of infected cells. Then this is rosetting, adherence of the infected cell to other uninfected cells. So this is the cytoadherence part of the pathogenesis. Then you have your host response. Host response takes place by general vascular permeability, increased vascular permeability, as well as augmented splenic clearance of anything, be it blood cells or inflammatory cytokines. Then you have immunological factors which are released whenever the RBC ruptures and releases the merozoites into the cell. There is a release of pro-inflammatory as well as anti-inflammatory cytokines, but the pro-inflammatory cytokines override the number of anti-inflammatory cytokines. So your pro-inflammatory cytokines are TNF, interleukin 1, 6 and 18, as well as interferon gamma. Uh, Along with the cytokine pathway, both cell-mediated as well as humoral immunity also play a role. So that's about the pathogenesis. Here you can see your RBC is rupturing to release merozoites into the bloodstream. You can see RBCs again, antibodies developing against the RBCs. Antibodies are developing against the antigen. Then you have cell-mediated immunity in the form of macrophages. Then you have your cytokines being released, your TNF, interleukin 1610, 1618, interferon gamma. These cytokines tend to act on the bone marrow and depress the bone marrow functions, resulting in dyserythropoiesis. So there's a resultant anemia as well as thrombocytopenia seen in malaria infection. So coming to the clinical features, first I'll talk about the uncomplicated malaria. Uncomplicated malaria, your features are quite non-specific. The incubation period is for around 2 weeks. Non-specific symptoms like headache, muscle pains. Muscle pains are present, but they're not as severe as seen in dengue infection. And there's no muscle tenderness like it's seen in leptospirosis. There can also be a vague abdominal discomfort as a result of hepatosplenomegaly. There's also lethargy and decreased dysphoria. There's also severe malaise and loss of appetite and high-grade fever with chills. On examination, you'll find signs of anemia, hepatosplenomegaly. Okay. I'll talk about the fever patterns for a little bit. I told you the erythrocytic cycle. The 2-day fever cycle is seen in Plasmodium vivax, Plasmodium ovale, and also Plasmodium falciparum. But falciparum has a very unpredictable pattern of presentation. Okay, so how you want to remember, instead of 2WO, just remember T, V, and O. Okay, so T, V, and O. 2-day fever cycle, vivax and ovale. So this is called as tertian malaria. 3-day fever cycle seen in case of Plasmodium malaria, the erythrocytic cycle lasts for 72 hours. So remember, the M of malaria looks like the number 3, okay, sideways. So this fever pattern is called quartan malaria. P. falciparum can either present with tertian pattern of fever or a variable pattern. Okay, so fever has been described as paroxysms of high grade fever. It can go up to 104, associated with intense headache, cold chills, dramatical rigors associated with shaking of limbs as well as chattering of teeth. And once the fever subsides, it's followed by profuse perspiration. So that's the fever of malaria. So this is again your, don't have to discuss this. Just remember that relapses are seen in case of bivax and oval because uh, um, there are dormant forms left in the liver called as hypnozoites. Whereas complications are frequently seen in case of Plasmodium malaria as well as falciparum. Um, so that's all about this table. Then coming to what I've described so far is non-specific symptoms of uncomplicated malaria. Now I'm coming to severe malaria. Severe malaria is characteristically seen in falciparum malaria, okay, Plasmodium falciparum infection. But severe malaria has also been reported with cases of Plasmodium vivax and Knowlesi. Okay, typically you see multisystemic involvement. These are all the subheadings that I'll be talking about. We'll start with cerebral malaria. We'll talk about metabolic acidosis. There's also a bit of anemia. Then there are frequent episodes of hypoglycemia. There's also renal involvement, renal impairment, respiratory distress, something called black water fever, shock, also known as algid malaria, bleeding tendencies, and hypoparasitemia. So we'll talk about cerebral malaria. This is an important topic. This was mentioned separately along with malaria. So please pay attention. So cerebral malaria presents as diffuse encephalopathy. Okay, the pathogenesis is thought to be sequestration of the infected RBC, which forms rosettes as well as autoagglutination within the cerebral microcirculation. So the sequestration happens in the capillaries where the cellular cell-mediated immunity is unable to act. So there's no way to avoid this or overcome this unless we treat the malaria itself. So diffuse encephalopathy as a result of sequestration of infected RBC. Patient presents with unrousable coma. Unrousable meaning patient cannot be woken up. Okay, GCS is typically less than 11. Your GCS is measured for a total points of 15. Okay, sometimes it's preceded by generalized seizures. Overall population about 15% have generalized seizures, but almost 50% of the pediatric population present with seizures preceding the coma. Okay, so this can develop anywhere between 2 to 5 days of fever. In younger age group, it comes within 2 days of fever. In older age group, it can take up to 5 days. In the younger age group, coma is the more common. Coma with seizures are the more common presentation. Whereas in older patients, patient can also have slightly altered sensorium or agitation. Okay. So there are no focal deficits described, but a few signs have been described. So signs can be divergent squint, bruxism. Bruxism means brushing of the jaws, okay, grinding of the jaws, I'm sorry. Then you have a positive pout reflex and non-specific motor findings. Patient can have either spasticity or rigidity. Patient can have exaggerated reflexes or normal reflexes. Babinski plantar or normal plantar, rigidity, decorticate rigidity or decerebrate rigidity. Okay? But one pathognomonic feature is when you do an ophthalmoscopy, you'll see retinal hemorrhages. Okay? Especially in pediatric age group, this can be confused with febrile seizures. There's no way you can really differentiate except by doing a smear for malarial parasite. You have to prove the presence of malarial parasites on peripheral smear. It can also be confused with meningoencephalitis, but in cerebral malaria, there is no neck stiffness or any signs of meningeal irritation. But along with malaria, they can be coexisting bacteremia. So there can be some underlying sepsis which can cause encephalopathy. So it's safer to treat with broad spectrum antibiotic along with antimalarial until and unless your sepsis is disproved when you get your blood tests. So these are some diagrams. In the first diagram, you can see a divergent squint. This is a positive pout reflex. This is what? Decerebrate rigidity. Okay, generalized extension. Management, you want to rule out other causes like hypoglycemia or cerebral abscess or metabolic encephalopathy or other causes of coma. Generally, it is advised to avoid LP because not that there is cerebral edema in all cases of cerebral malaria, but in very, very end stage severe cases, there can be cerebral edema. And when you do an LP on a patient with cerebral edema, there will be coning and brainstem compression and death. So, generally, it's advised to avoid LP unless really needed. You have to admit the patient to ICU because patient is in coma. You have to do eye care. You have to cover the eyelids shut in order to avoid ulcers, corneal ulcers. You have to give regular feeding through a nasogastric gastric tube. Foley's catheter is required because patient keeps bedwetting. Because the patient is in coma, you need to intubate in order to protect the airways. Uh, because the patient is not taking proper oral feeds, and in case the patient is on quinine, there is also a chance of developing hypoglycemia. So you have to monitor the sugars at least once in 4 hours or once in 6 hours. Watch for seizures. Prophylactic treatment is not required, is not indicated, but in case of seizures, you can treat with either IV or rectal diazepam or phenobarbital. So full recovery can be expected within 24 to 48 hours of presentation. Once you treat the infection with parenteral antimalarial, artesunate, or quinine, you usually see a dramatic recovery. But up to 25% of patients, usually children, can have long-term neurological deficits like hemiplegia, cortical blindness, visual field defects, aphasia, cerebellar symptoms. Subtle cognitive impairment can persist in patients who present with hypoglycemia and seizures. So that's about cerebral malaria. Now we are coming to acidosis. So acidosis is defined as a venous plasma bicarbonate level less than 15 millimoles per liter, or a lactate levels more than 5 millimoles per liter. Causes are thought to be dehydration leading to renal failure. Other causes are lactic acidosis as a result of tissue ischemia. Why do you have tissue ischemia? Because your microcirculation is blocked by your malarial parasite in the blood, in the RBC, as well as reduced hepatic clearance as well as renal clearance because of dysfunction. Okay, so not only lactic acid, there can also be uric acid accumulation, any multiple organic acid accumulation. So venous metabolic acidosis closely correlates with mortality. Any patient who has metabolic acidosis is very likely to develop refractory hypotension, which does not respond to fluid therapy. It does not respond to inotrope. Okay, so you have to treat the acidosis. You have to treat the underlying cause. So management is with very careful fluid resuscitation. In case you're suspecting dehydration and pre-renal failure, IV bicarbonate injection is indicated if the only if the pH is less than 7.1. Dialysis can also be done if it is indicated, for two indications actually. One is for renal failure with creatinine more than 5, or metabolic acidosis itself with pH less than 7. Okay, so that's how you treat acidosis. Then you have anemia. So anemia is a hematocrit of less than 15%. Uh, Harrison says 15%, but I think the infectious diseases textbook says 20%. Okay, either hematocrit less than 15 or a hemoglobin level of less than 5 grams per deciliter. So on peripheral smear, it shows a normocytic and normochromic picture. Several causes have been postulated. So first is the RBCs get destroyed during the rupture of the Schizont. The RBCs get destroyed during the Schizont rupture. Then there is increased clearance of both infected as well as non-infected RBC by splenic sinusoids. Then there can be low reticulocyte count and anemia because of dyserythropoiesis. I told you about the bone marrow suppression caused by the cytokines which are released when the Schizont ruptures. Okay. Apart from these, there can also be coexisting bacteremia, sepsis. There can also be coexisting HIV infection, hookworm infestation, as well as nutritional deficiencies in the form of vitamin A and B12. Okay, so you can transfuse either whole blood or packed cells. Uh, if the hematocrit is less than 15 to 20, or if the hemoglobin is less than 5, be very careful that the patient doesn't go into fluid overload and pulmonary edema. Okay, that's one thing you have to think about. So give Lasix before transfusion. Your next complication is hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia defined as a blood glucose of less than 40 milligrams per deciliter. Hypoglycemia, unfortunately, is more common in small children and pregnant females. Okay. Then causes of hypoglycemia, either increased metabolic demand or decreased supply. Okay, metabolic demand is due to the anaerobic glycolysis. It can be because of the febrile illness itself. It's a catabolic state, increased energy consumption, as well as the parasite. It keeps eating up all the energy that's produced. Okay, so those are the causes of increased demands. Decreased supply can be due to lethargy, decreased intake of food, vomiting, which is one of the features. Then failure of hepatic gluconeogenesis. Okay, because your hepatic parenchymal cells are also affected in the initial pre-erythrocytic stage. Another cause is thought to be quinine. Okay, quinine is used in the treatment of complicated malaria. So quinine is a drug which stimulates pancreatic insulin secretion, and it's one of the causes of hyperinsulinemic hypoglycemia. So if you have a patient on quinine, it's very important to keep giving dextrose infusion along with quinine, and to keep monitoring the GRBS a minimum of second to fourth hourly. Okay, so treatment is with IV dextrose and frequent monitoring of GRBS. Then we are coming to renal impairment. Renal impairment described as a plasma creatinine greater than 3 milligrams per deciliter, or a urine output less than 400 milliliters per day, or in children and young adults less than 12 milliliters per kg body weight per 24 hours. Okay. So acute renal failure happens because of dehydration, pre-renal failure. You have acute tubular necrosis because that area is it's a highly vascular area. So when you have dehydration, that's one of the first areas that gets hit. Then you can have renal microvascular obstruction because of what I said about the rosetting and the autoadherence. Then you can also have cellular injury because of all the sequestration and as well as the cytokine release. One thing to remember, chronic Plasmodium malaria infection can cause immune complex deposition and glomerulonephritis and lead to nephrotic syndrome. But that's not seen in all kinds. So how do you treat? You want to hydrate very judiciously in Plasmodium malaria. Be very careful about fluid replacement. Monitor RFT electrolytes daily, both urea as well as creatinine. Keep following your input output. Watch for decreased urine output. Renal replacement therapy if needed. Hemodialysis is more preferred than peritoneal dialysis. That's your acute tubular necrosis, that's your hemodialysis. Then coming to respiratory distress, you find that patients have deep labored breathing and present with tachypnea. Respiratory depression is associated with a very poor outcome. So it's thought to be cytokine mediated. Uh, it's thought to be cytokine mediated, but other causes can be anemia. Anemia itself, with a HB as low as 5 or 6, it can precipitate heart failure. They can also be concomitant LRTI. Why will you have LRTI if the patient is in cerebral malaria, patient is in coma, patient having vomiting? There is every likelihood that the patient will aspirate and develop a concomitant LRTI. Another possibility, if the patient is a cerebral malaria patient on anticonvulsants, certain anticonvulsant medication like phenobarbital and benzodiazepines can cause respiratory depression when taken together. Finally, some adults can develop ARDS as a result of increased pulmonary capillary permeability. So the treatment is to give fluids very judiciously, restrict fluid as far as possible, avoid overhydration, and positive pressure mechanical ventilation if needed. So that's your ARDS picture on chest X-ray. Then we have black water fever. It's thought to be the patient develops cola-colored urine because of massive intravascular hemolysis. This is thought to occur because of DIC, um, as well as risk factors like G6PD, underlying G6PD deficiency, and use of other oxidative drugs like Primapril. So this may contribute to renal failure also because of oxidative stress. Your tubules may get affected. Then treatment is by transfusion if needed, bicarbonate administration if needed. That's your patient's urine, cola-colored urine. It on dilution, it becomes a little less light. I mean, less dark. Then we have shock, also described as algid malaria. So in the book, it says, Harrison says systolic blood pressure less than 80 millimeters in adults, systolic less than 50 in pediatric population. So this is called as algid malaria. It's thought to be because of vasodilatation caused by release of nitric oxide species. It can also be because of dehydration or concomitant sepsis, either LRTI or UTI. So treatment is by fluids. You can use inotropic drugs and also start the patient on higher level of antibiotics if you're suspecting sepsis. Then you can have abnormal bleeding. Patients with malaria usually have thrombocytopenia with platelet count less than 1 lakh per millimeter cube. Cause is not really explained. It can be because of splenic clearance, splenic filtration and clearance of thrombocytes, or decreased production of thrombopoietin. Just like you have erythropoietin synthesis in the kidneys, you have thrombopoietin being synthesized in the liver. So when your liver is affected in malaria, you can have decreased production of thrombopoietin. Another thing to consider is dyserythropoiesis because of bone marrow suppression. Also consider DIC in case of sepsis. So bleeding for thrombocytopenia, no intervention has been described. You can transfuse packed RBC if it is needed. Okay. Last subheading, this is not really described in all of the textbooks, but hyperparasitemia. Hyperparasitemia described as more than 10% of infected RBC in the whole volume of blood. Okay, and more than 5% infected RBC in case of non-immune adult, immunocompromised adult. Okay, you want to give prompt parenteral antimalarials and also consider exchange transfusion if needed. Malaria in pregnancy, lot of potential complications. They can be maternal anemia, hypoglycemia, pulmonary edema. Patient can go into premature labor. The fetus can develop fetal distress. They can be low birth weight, increased. Sir, excuse me. నేను ఇక్కడ మాట్లాడుతూ ఉంటే ఫీలింగ్ డిస్టర్బ్డ్. ఐ వెరీ సారీ, వెరీ సారీ. I'm sorry. The fetus can develop fetal distress. They can be low birth weight infants, increased incidence of infant mortality. Congenital malaria has been described in about 5% of cases, and in some cases, maternal death. So that's about malaria and pregnancy. The treatment is similar to most normal individuals, only we don't give tetracyclines and doxycycline in pregnancy. Okay. So diagnosis, any person who has traveled to a malaria endemic area in the last 2 months, we should consider a diagnosis of malaria. There's also something called airport malaria. Even if the person hasn't traveled to an endemic area, if he has been to an airport and if he has been exposed to infected mosquitoes that got out of a plane from an endemic region that's been described. Another malaria that's been described is transfusion malaria, being transfused from the infected blood of the donor. Yeah, so there's the history to consider. You also have to consider. You also have to see microscopy, and there are a few rapid diagnostic tests. Okay, so microscopy you can use the Jamesa stain, field stain, Wright stain, and Leishman stain. Thin film is used to diagnose the species. Okay, whereas thick film is used to diagnose the parasite density. So the thick film is more sensitive, whereas the thin film is used for identification of species. So these are diagrams. These are approximately how your thin film looks. You can see the ring forms in some of these diagrams. The thick film. One thing to remember: your thin film finding is expressed per 1000 RBC. Okay, number of parasites per 1000 RBC. Thick blood film, you describe it as number of parasites per 200 WBC. Okay, so that's your thin smear. That's your thick smear. Then you have rapid diagnostic tests like card test, dipstick tests, unfortunately described only in case of Plasmodium falciparum. Okay. So also you have molecular tools like quantitative PCR. The drawbacks of these tests are you cannot assess other parasites, other species other than Plasmodium falciparum. You cannot find out the extent of parasitemia and the stages in which the parasite is present. And also there is a chance of false positives because even after curing of the infection, your antigens tend to stick around in the serum for at least a couple of weeks. So these are the drawbacks. Okay. Other lab tests, you do your CBC. I'm not going to discuss these things in detail. CBC, you have anemia, thrombocytopenia. You can have increased WBC count in case of sepsis. Coagulation profile is deranged, increased PT and PT APTT, decreased fibrinogen levels. RBS, you find hypoglycemia in case of severe malaria infection. LFT derangement in the form of increased bilirubin, both direct and indirect. Direct because of uh, uh, hepatic parenchymal cell infection. Indirect because of RBC destruction. Okay, you can also have cholestatic pattern of LFT derangement. Also, your AST and ALT can be increased. More than 3 times increase from the upper level is considered significant. RFT, both creatinine as well as urea can be deranged. ABG will show a picture of metabolic acidosis. Lactate levels will be increased. Chest X-ray can show a picture of ARDS. Muscle enzymes are also found to be increased because it's a catabolic disease. Poor prognostic factors, I'm not going to read out all these things, more or less all the things that I described already. There's a much nicer version of this table in Harrison, please look at it. So differential diagnosis. Based on fever, you have to rule out other bacterial infections like typhoid, leptospirosis, brucellosis. Viral causes of fevers like dengue, influenza. I told you in non-specific, uncomplicated malaria, it will resemble influenza infection. They can also have concurrent respiratory tract infection, UTI separately also. Other parasitic infections like leishmaniasis, trypanosomiasis. Cerebral malaria should be differentiated from metabolic causes like hypoglycemia, hyponatremia, any causes of meningoencephalitis like bacterial or viral. Enteric fever itself can cause a sort of encephalitis picture and also trypanosomiasis. Then when you have anemia, you have to rule out other causes of anemia like hemoglobinopathies. HIV can cause long-standing anemia, nutritional causes like deficiency of iron, deficiency of vitamin B12, and hookworm infestation. Renal failure, you want to rule out sickle cell disease. Sickle cell disease has a very similar pathogenesis to uh, falciparum malaria and other causes like leptospirosis, CKD, underlying CKD. Then when you have jaundice and hepatomegaly, rule out viral causes, viral hepatitis, CMV infection, EBV infection, drugs like alcohol. So these are some of the differential diagnoses that you can consider. Treatment, we'll start with supportive treatment. If you have a patient with fever, you have to give antibiotics. We give either IV or oral paracetamol at least round the clock, at least 4 times a day. So hyperparasitemia, renal failure, acidosis can be treated with hemodialysis or hemofiltration. Anticonvulsants like diazepam or phenobarbital can be used to treat seizures. If you have hypoglycemia, give continuous IV dextrose with frequent monitoring of GRBS. When you have a patient with anemia, administer either fresh or packed RBC to the patient. When you have shock, be judicious with the IV fluids. Avoid overloading the patient with fluids. Encourage oral intake. Now coming to specifics of the treatment, uncomplicated malaria, I've only mentioned some of the drugs. I don't want to read out all the doses because you won't remember, but this table is excellent in Harrison. Please refer. So chloroquine sensitive malaria, you give a dose of chloroquine. The first dose will be around 600 mg, followed by a dose of 300 mg given at 12, 24, and 36 hours, or amodiaquine. Okay. Then radical treatment when you have a patient with bivax or oval infection. What did I say? They have a dormant infection. Okay. The hypnozoids can keep causing relapses of the fever. So along with chloroquine, you also want to add primaquine at doses of 0.5 mg per kilograms in tropical regions, 0.25 mg per kilograms in temperate regions, given for a total of 14 days. If the patient has any trace of G6PD deficiency, give a lesser dose at a, of 0.75 milligrams per, I'm sorry, a higher dose, 0.75 milligrams per kg, given once a week for a duration of 8 weeks. Okay. If there is severe G6PD deficiency, please avoid primaquine. Okay. Sensitive falciparum malaria, you give artesunate along with sulfadoxine and pyrimethamine, or artesunate along with amodiaquine. Multi-drug resistant falciparum malaria, artemether lumefantrine combination given for a duration of 3 days. Artesunate given for 3 days along with mefloquine or dihydroartemisinin piperaquine. Then treatment of imported malaria, second line treatment, you can give either artesunate in decreased doses or quinine for a duration of 7 days, along with either tetracycline or doxycycline or clindamycin. Or instead of artesunate with tetracycline, doxycycline, you can give atovaquone and proguanil combination. Treatment of severe falciparum malaria, you have to give IV antimalarials, artesunate at doses of 2.5 milligrams per kg IV, given stat, followed by the same dose 12 hours later, followed by the same dose 24 hours later. Okay, so usually we give 3 to 5 doses after the loading dose. Okay. Or you can give artemether 3.2 milligrams per kg IM, followed by 1.6 milligrams per kg. Quinine can also be given. The loading dose is 20 milligrams per kg given over 4 hours, followed by 10 milligrams per kg given slowly over 2 to 8 hours. This dose is given 8th hourly. Please remember to monitor GRBS when you're giving quinine for the patient, and also no harm in giving 25 dextrose or a continuous infusion of 10% dextrose. Quinidine can also be given. Then chemoprophylaxis, there's a very nice table in Harrison. I haven't included the dose, the duration, when to give it, for how many days to give it after coming back. Please refer the textbook. But these are the drugs you use. Atovaquone, proguanil, chloroquine, doxycycline, hydroxychloroquine, very much in the news lately because of COVID-19, mefloquine and primaquine. So I'll be talking about two of the chronic complications. The first one is tropical splenomegaly, also known as hyperreactive malarial syndrome. Okay. Mm. So this is a result of chronic repeated infections. Chronic repeated malarial infection in endemic area produces hypergamma globulinemia. Okay. There is increased production of IgM. Actually, this is all from Harrison. It's not very clear. So there's increased production of IgM, which is targeted towards the CD8 plus T cells. Okay, so there's increased destruction of CD8 T plus CD8 plus T cells, increased production of cytotoxic IgM antibody, as a result of which there is a reversal of the CD4 to CD8 ratio. Okay, increased destruction of CD8 T cells. This IgM antibody is later taken up by the spleen. Okay, so when it's taken up by the spleen, it results in the hypertrophy of the reticular endothelial system, as a result of which there is splenomegaly. As a result of splenomegaly, the patient ends up with pancytopenia. As a result of pancytopenia, the patient is very susceptible to all kinds of infections, predominantly respiratory tract infections as well as skin infection. So the patient is very immunologically vulnerable. It's not a good condition. It's not a good. It doesn't carry a good prognosis. Most patients, sooner or later, they die of overwhelming sepsis because of secondary infection. So you have to keep treating the infection. You have to treat the uh, for as long as the patient is in the endemic region. You have to treat with antimalarials. Mefloquine has been used, chloroquine has also been used, proguanil has also been used. Okay, so you have to use it for as long as the patient is in the endemic region. uh, Splenomegaly can be considered if there is no improvement, if there is no clinical improvement, even after 6 months of using antimalarial. Um, okay, so there is some genetic component, there is some hereditary component. The disease coexists more in patients who have first degree relatives in with the same condition. It's more commonly manifests among pregnant women. Patient presents with an abdominal mass or a dragging abdominal pain. Sometimes they can be a pricking type of pain because of perisplenitis. Because of the size of the spleen, it is also very susceptible to splenic rupture, and that is an emergency. Okay, so on peripheral smear you see anemia and pancytopenia, but malarial parasites may not be found. However, you will find an increased levels of IgM. Okay. So I've talked about all this. Anti-malarial chemoprophylaxis have a good prognosis. This is a clonal lymphoproliferative condition. It can transform later into a lymphocytic malignancy, okay, a lymphoma. So it doesn't carry a good prognosis. This is something I picked up from Google. Okay, so yeah, so for diagnosis, you have to have massive splenomegaly greater than 10 centimeters. Patient can also have hepatomegaly, IgM levels greater than 2 times the two standard deviations above normal. On treating with antimalarials, there is both clinical as well as immunological response. The hepatomegaly decreases, the splenomegaly decreases, and also the IgM levels decrease. So that's your massive patient with massive splenomegaly. Then cotton malarial nephropathy, it's seen in chronic Plasmodium malaria infection. Um, Causes immune mediated injury to the renal glomeruli, results in nephrotic syndrome. Patient can present with facial puffiness, pedal edema, oliguria, or albuminuria. On histology, there is focal or segmental glomerulonephritis, dense deposits on electron microscopy, complement and IgG deposits on immunofluorescent microscopy. This responds very poorly to antimalarials and glucocorticoids, but cytotoxic therapy can show results. So that's about nephropathy. Few words about prevention and malaria control. So three principal components. First is to reduce the contact between the vector and the human host. Second is to prevent the disease through prophylactic antimalarial drugs. The third is early diagnosis and treatment. Okay, so reduction of contact between vector and human host, you can do it via multiple routes. Screening of windows, protective clothing, wear long sleeves, wear long pants, cover your faces. Usage of insect repellents, both topical, like your mosquito repellent creams, as well as spatial. Spatial is your mosquito nets and all. Mosquito nets which are infused with insecticides have been showing great efficiency. Insecticide spraying inside the indoor residual compounds, insecticide impregnated bed nets. Okay. Then prevention of disease through prophylactic antimalarial. Please go back and refer that table that I told you about in Harrison. This is advised to any travelers who are visiting endemic countries because they are at risk of developing malaria. Intermittent presumptive treatment, commonly used drugs are amodiaquine and sulfadoxine pyrimethamine. Early diagnosis and treatment, I'm not talking about. I've already told you treatment and diagnosis. Then lastly, we have the malaria vaccine. Vaccine is still under development. Uh, Only falciparum malaria has been considered, but because it causes the most serious infection. But it's very difficult to develop it because the uh, parasite itself is genetically very complex, and the proteins are highly antigenically variable. Okay? So purified immunoglobulin, which is obtained from the blood of infected endemic populations, can passively transfer some amount of immunity. Cell mediated immunity is not yet completely understood. One vaccine that's been developed is called RTSS. It's a recombinant protein pre-erythrocytic stage vaccine. um, Certain large phase trials have been conducted, which have shown only a 53% efficiency, that too in patients between 5 to 17 months old. Okay, in younger patients, the efficiency is even less. So it's been decided that there's no point including this vaccine in the childhood vaccination schedule. Other vaccines being developed are attenuated whole parasite vaccines, quite challenging both to manufacture and administer, and vaccines which target the various blood stages as well as asexual stages. So I think this is the last slide. I think this is the last slide. Yeah, no? Doubts ఉండదు ఇప్పుడు డౌట్స్ అంటే
అడగొచ్చు, అడుగుతారా?
అక్కర్లేదు